So Steve Bannon's trial for criminal contempt of Congress kicks off tomorrow in federal district court in Washington, D.C. What can we expect? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So Steve Bannon's contempt of Congress case kicks off tomorrow morning in federal district court in Washington, D.C., my old stomping grounds, the courthouse in which I used to try RICO cases. And I'll be there in the courtroom. I'll be covering it for MSNBC. I'll be covering it for you here on my Justice Matters channel. I'll also try to sort of tweet out in real time, give you some sense of how the case is playing out in court. But let's start with some of today's reporting. This from the Washington Post. Facing trial, Bannon vows to go medieval, but judge says, meh. Okay, I have to admit, I like that headline. And the article begins, former Trump advisor and right-wing podcaster Stephen K. Bannon promised the contempt of Congress charges against him would become a misdemeanor from hell for the Biden administration. But after judicial rulings against his proposed defense, legal experts said his trial, set to start Monday, could be more of a quick trip through court. At a recent hearing that left Bannon's legal strategy in tatters, his lawyer, David Schoen, asked U.S. District Court Judge Carl Nichols, what's the point of going to trial if there are no defenses? The judge simply replied, agreed. Okay, that was an amusing but frankly inappropriate thing for Judge Nichols to say, because every defendant has a right to take his or her case to trial regardless of the strength of the defense, the weakness of the defense, the absence of any legitimate defense. So I didn't really applaud Judge Nichols when he made that smart alecky comment. But let's take a look at what we can expect from Steve Bannon's trial. Let's do a quick preview of Bannon's case by the numbers. The first number, 2. That's the number of charges he's indicted on. 2 charges of contempt of Congress, 1 for unlawfully defying a congressional subpoena for testimony, and a 2nd for unlawfully defying a congressional subpoena for documents. Another number, 1 year. That's the maximum punishment for each count of contempt of Congress. Another number, 1 month. If Steve Bannon is convicted of either count of contempt of Congress, the minimum prison term for a conviction is 1 month. So a judge has no discretion. For openers, he has to sentence Steve Bannon to at least 1 month in prison if he's convicted of a contempt of Congress charge. Now, what about if he's convicted of both charges? Well, in theory, that would be a 2-year maximum prison term if you add the 2 sentences together, and a 60-day mandatory minimum. But that's only if he's convicted on both counts and if Judge Nichols decides to run the sentences consecutive to one another rather than concurrent with one another. But in theory, he's facing up to 2 years in prison with at least 60 days in prison if he's convicted on both counts. The next question, can Steve Bannon get a fair and impartial jury? The answer is absolutely. It will be a challenge. There will be lots of questioning of the potential jurors to try to see if they can sit fairly and impartially, setting aside any biases, any ideological preferences they might have, politically speaking. It's okay if they've heard about the case. The goal is never to find people who haven't heard about the case. That would be nice in a perfect world, but in this day and age, that's unrealistic. The key is whether anything they heard would cause them to have such preconceived notions or such strong feelings about the case one way or another that they couldn't put those strong feelings aside and decide the case based only on the evidence that's introduced at trial. Most jurors can sort of pass that test, can make it through that litany of questions, and they do take an oath to answer all questions from the judge and from the parties truthfully, fully, accurately. And in my experience, I spent 30 years as a courtroom prosecutor in jurisdictions both military and civilian, in jurisdictions both federal and state. And in my experience, most jurors take their jury service responsibilities really seriously. Let's take a look at one example of that. Remember when Paul Manafort was tried a couple of years ago now? Paul Manafort was Donald Trump's deeply corrupt and criminal campaign chairman, committed all sorts of crime, was indicted, was prosecuted across the river in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Virginia, by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Virginia, and he was convicted. And what we came to learn, because some of the jurors gave interviews to the media after the trial, is there was one woman on the jury who was a self-proclaimed Donald Trump loyalist. She called herself part of the MAGA crew, and she said, you know what, I wore my Make America Great hat to trial every day as I drove there in my car. I took it off, I left it in the car. I went and did my jury duty for the day, got back in my car at the end of the day, I put my red hat back on, and I drove home. And she said some version of, you know, I didn't want to convict Paul Manafort. I'm a big Donald Trump fan, supporter, loyalist. I didn't want to convict Donald Trump's campaign chairman. But the evidence proved his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And I took an oath to decide the case based only on the evidence. So I had to vote guilty, even if I wasn't that thrilled about it. That's an example of jury service at its finest. And frankly, that was my experience for decades inside courtrooms. Jurors take their oath to decide a case in a fair and impartial way based only on the evidence. They take it very seriously. So can a fair and impartial jury be impaneled to try Steve Bannon? Absolutely. All right, friends, now let's finish with this. Because Steve Bannon said, I'm going to go medieval on their you-know-whats. And he said, this is going to be the Biden administration's misdemeanor case from hell. Big, brave, strong, double, triple shirted Steve Bannon. You know what, friends? I was in the courthouse back in November of 2019 covering Roger Stone's criminal trial. Remember Roger Stone, who lied to Congress, tampered with and threatened witnesses, obstructed an official proceeding, was convicted on all 7 counts. And Judge Amy Berman Jackson said, yeah, Mr. Stone, you weren't convicted for standing up for Donald Trump. You were convicted for covering up for Donald Trump, for which he was pardoned. Don't get me started. Hopefully, that pardon will be challenged at some point soon. That is my fervent hope, because it was a corruptly delivered pardon that should be invalidated by the courts. We just need to step up and challenge it. But I digress. I was in court watching Roger Stone's trial, and I saw when Steve Bannon got dragged into the courtroom, basically with the prosecutors kind of figuratively tugging on his ear, because he really didn't want to testify, but he did testify. He testified against Roger Stone. And here's how it played out. Oh, it was just priceless. He was on the witness stand, and he hemmed, and he hawed, and he didn't want to be there, and he couldn't remember. I don't recall. It's so very hard. And they said, Mr. Bannon, who was the Trump campaign's access point to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, you know, for those weaponized emails that were being released and were being used to damage Hillary Clinton and her campaign. And when he was asked who was the Trump campaign's access point to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, he said, I don't know, I can't say, I don't remember. Mr. Bannon, isn't it a fact that you testified before the grand jury on such and such a date? Yes. And weren't you placed under oath before you were asked questions by the prosecutor in the grand jury? Yes. And weren't you asked the following question and didn't you give the following answer under oath before the grand jury? Question by the prosecutor, who was the Trump campaign's access point to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange? And your answer, Mr. Bannon, was Roger Stone. Isn't that how you testified? Yes. Yeah, Steve Bannon didn't go medieval on anybody. Steve Bannon performed like a stone-cold punk. He had to have the truth pulled out of him, pretending like he didn't know. I can't remember. This is so hard. I don't want to be here. Come on now. But he ended up testifying against Roger Stone, provided a bit of damning testimony that certainly helped lead to Roger Stone's across-the-board convictions. What an ugly assortment of criminals. Donald Trump's men. So he can bluff and bluster and puff out his chest, and I'm going to go medieval. It's going to be the misdemeanor case from hell. Yeah, we'll see, Steve. You know, if the way you performed in Roger Stone's trial is any indication, you're going to go out with a whimper, not with a bang. But I'll be there, friends, covering it and trying to give you updates in real time on Twitter and trying to knock out Justice Matters videos at the end of the trial day and give you some sense of how Steve Bannon was behaving himself. The evidence is overwhelming because he clearly defied congressional subpoenas. He has no defense, as his lawyer admitted in open court last week. So I would suspect the jury will reach the right result based on the evidence, and that will be guilty, holding Bannon accountable for his crimes. But I'll do my best to bring it all to you in as close to real time as I can. In the meantime, friends, please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.